Good day. Today is Wednesday, November the 11th. It is, yes, Veterans Day, but it's also International Armistice Day because, as you know, on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, a ceasefire was called in Europe, basically ending World War One, which is why Veterans Day is on this day, but it's more applicable to AP Euro because, yeah, World War One was primarily a European war, which we will look at later on. So yes, and all right. So what do we have looking forward? This is going to be a busy 10 days. Um, Today we begin this new chapter. Friday you have two things, but remember you don't have to do them Friday. But I'm going to start looking at your test on Monday. So it'd be really cool if you had it by then. I did put a deadline of November the 20th on that. And I will tell you, I'm not really too excited about going back and grading late tests. So, but I am telling you, I'm going to do the test first. So that way you'll have more time, more leisure time to go and do the LEQ, which you are, also assigned. So Friday, there's this big, massive test, 200 points. It contains, where did I put that? Give me a sec, shall we? Quizzes. All right, let's pull him up. Age of Science and Reason test. There we are. We're going to look at the front page. Okay. Let's say now look. Test will cover a lot of territory. It will have two sets of matching questions. Okay. Two sets. The second set, which comes late in the test, has a lot of the names of inventors and originators of new ideas, et cetera, et cetera. One set has 21 matching, one set has 26 matching, a series of multiple choice, but also there's some true and false questions in there, which you should be able to blow through pretty quickly, and two short answer questions. Notice that it's worth 200 points, and notice that if you have a time limit of 60 minutes. So yeah, you have that. That's 200 points. And then you also have an LEQ, which I will not show you, but it's a historical LEQ. And it too is due technically Sunday night. But I'll start looking at that later. Grade the test first, look at the LEQ later in case you wanted to fudge a little bit and give yourself more time, but don't make it a habit. Well, don't fudge too long. Okay? And so let's get into this new unit. AP Modern European Society and Economy under the old regime of the 18th century. Basically, what Europe was like prior to the French Revolution. As it says there, pre-French Revolutionary Europe was based on four things. Check the clock. A, aristocratic elites, meaning the nobility. I like big words, and I cannot lie. Aristocratic elites possessing a wide variety of inherited legal privileges, the nobility. Now, there was a time in the Middle Ages when the ancestors of these people actually did something. They actually defended the manor. They actually put their lives on the line to defend the manor from other invaders. However, by the 18th century, Europe has stabilized into several countries. You don't have the constant warfare anymore. And so basically, as generations passed, the nobility were looked upon by the serfs and peasants, and particularly by the commoners who weren't serfs or peasants who lived in the city. They looked upon the nobility as being being useless. They had all these ranks and privileges, and they didn't do anything for them. And so that's a thing going forward, going into the French Revolution. That certain people have certain rights that they didn't earn, really. Rights by birth. B, established churches, aka the Roman Catholic Church, intimately related to the state and the aristocracy. Throughout much of Europe, the Roman Catholic Church officials, bishops, archbishops, occupied government posts, giving them an inordinate amount of power. Also, there was discontent with the fact that the Roman Catholic Church encouraged inequality amongst peoples and taxed 10%, etc. And, an urban labor force is the third thing. An urban labor force, in other words, people who work in the city, usually organized into guilds. And once again, guilds are basically what we would call labor unions. They were people who would organize themselves so that they could keep out cost-cutting competition. And that was their primary purpose, to keep out cost-cutting competition. And finally, a rural peasantry subject to high taxes. That hurts my hands. Subject to high taxes and feudal dues. You say, what are feudal dues? Well, they had to do what the lords, the nobility said. They, for example, they could not dress, even if they had the money. They could not dress like the nobility did. They could not hunt and fish on the land of the nobility to supplement their table with protein in the wintertime. And there was a whole litany of things, having to bow still to these members of the nobility, not having the same opportunities, etc. So you have a rural peasantry subject to both high taxes. Remember that in France, and you're writing, in France, the third estate paid all the taxes. The first and second estate, the rich guys, paid no taxes. Third estate paid all the taxes, which is really a backwards system of raising revenue for a government. So, E and F are not really related to the first four. The peasants, through petitions and revolts, wanted the right to certain lands, hunting and fishing rights, courts, and grievance procedures, meaning the right to sue in court. And another thing that was important in pre-French Revolutionary Europe was the quality and quantity of the grain harvest. Remained the most important fact of life for most population and the gravest concern for the government. You say, well, what's going on there, Mr. Horton? Well, and I hope you're writing this down, Mr. Arlinghouse, but you have to remember, in 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe, and it may have killed 50% to 70% of the population. And that's devastating. However, the 30 to 50% who remained had plenty of food. Now, over time, since 1347, we're now into the 18th century, the population of Europe has continually, steadily rose, but the technology of farming was still pretty much stuck in the Middle Ages. So, in other words, the food supply had not grown, population had grown, and the population was beginning to exceed the food supply. By the French Revolution in France, wrap your head around this, by the French Revolution in France, starvation was a thing. People did starve to death. Today in Europe, nobody starves to death. But in the 18th century, yes. Too many people, not enough food. Welcome back, Thomas Malthus and Thanos. Part 2. The old medieval laws and customs remain often on the law books and were enforced rigidly during this century. Yeah. Laws that had been on the books since the Middle Ages. Laws that really had outlived their usefulness. We have the same thing. For example, in Alabama, it is still illegal for a man to beat his wife with a stick that is smaller than the circumference of his small finger. Thank you, Mr. DeMaria. Yeah, and that's still there. And there are lots of archaic laws, but yeah, these laws had outlived their usefulness, and yeah, these laws, though, forbade one class, particularly the lower class, from dressing like the upper class. Even if they had the wherewithal, even if they had the money, they could not dress in finery. The idea was to make each class visibly distinguishable. 18th century Europeans did not enjoy individual rights, civil rights. Their rights belonged to the group of which they were a part, you know, and rights were different for each group. Once again, three estates: clergy, nobility, and then everybody else. And the rights of each class differed. Upper classes enjoyed privileges such as, particularly in France, exemption from taxation or military service, or the right to practice a trade or craft, or to avoid a humiliating punishment. Yeah, these were all differences at random. Okay. Roman numeral 3. The 18th century was a great age for the aristocracy, nobility. Okay? The nobility in Europe consisted of 1% of the population in Western Europe to 5% of the population 5% of the population in Eastern Europe.
Interruption. Can a custodian please call 71309? Thank you.
Yeah. The nobility was the single wealthiest sector of the population, had the widest degree of social, political, and economic power, and set the tone for polite society. Land was the aristocracy's largest source of income. All of the land in Europe was owned by somebody. In fact, it was all owned by a small percentage of the population, which is one of the things that makes the Americas become so attractive. But yeah, all the land, particularly land in England, had been owned for generations, centuries. It was felt that manual labor was beneath the aristocracy, such as Spain, for example, when they went to the New World. Many of the nobles who came to the New World, Spain thought that doing physical work was beneath their dignity. In other parts of Europe, the nobility undertook ways to improve the economy and life in general. But don't get carried away with that. Roman 4, the aristocracy across the continent was not the same. Now, underline, the smallest, wealthiest, and most socially responsible aristocracy resided in Great Britain. Interesting stat. I mean, it's small wonder why the thinkers of the Enlightenment felt that Britain was some kind of a Enlightenment paradise, that the British got it all right, which is an over-exaggeration, of course. It, referring to the aristocracy of Britain, consisted of about 400 families, and the eldest male members of each family sat in the House of Lords, which at this time was the dominant house in Parliament. These noble families were also able to control the House of Commons as well. Why? Because they owned the great majority of the land. And to vote in England until 1832, you had to own a specific amount of land. The nobles owned 1/4 of all arable. You like that word, arable? It means you can use it for farming. The nobles owned 1/4 of all arable land in England, but increasingly the British nobility invested their monies in commerce, canals, urban real estate, mines, and even industry. Please tell me you remember the rule of primogeniture. Yes? Yes? Primus meaning first, genus meaning offspring. It is the rule of the firstborn, that the firstborn inherits the preponderance of the family's wealth, which is why, once again, most of the English males who came to this continent were second, third, fourth sons, etc., etc. All right. In France, approximately 400,000 nobles, Notice the difference. 400,000 nobles were divided into nobles of the sword. Nobles of the sword are people whose families actually can be traced back to the Middle Ages when nobles actually did stuff. And those of the robe. Those of the robe were nobles whose titles had come from serving government bureaucracy or even having been purchased. I mean, you could purchase in France, pre-revolutionary France, a rank of nobility. The nobility were divided into those connected with Versailles and those who were not. Those who were not, by the way, on your test were called the Hobos, who were a little better off than the wealthiest peasants. The word Hobos, have you ever seen that before? Hobos, or a word similar to that, Mr. Arlinghouse? During the Great Depression in this country, a lot of, and Mr. Arlinghouse and I watched Oh Brother, Where Art Thou over the last weekend. It's on AMC. It's a truly great film. And during the Great Depression, a large number of men were thrown out of work. And so they began searching the country for jobs. And they would ride the rails, illegally, of course. They would, sneak aboard freight cars and things like that. And the newspaper called them the Hobos, meaning kings of the road. They also call them kings of the road, but meaning the minor nobility, And of course, Americans being what they are, Hoboro was too many syllables, and so eventually they became known as hobos. Yeah. All French nobility were exempt from taxes. Period. All French nobility were exempt from taxes. Most French nobles did not pay the taille, or the land tax. The nobles were technically responsible for paying the vingtième, or the 20th, which was a sort of an income tax representing 5% of your income, 20th vingtième, but they rarely paid for it and were responsible for the full amount. Nobles were not liable for corvées, or forced labor, meaning the corvée was a type of tax that the king levied on the peasantry, which was paid not in money, but in forced labor on the king's projects. Nobles didn't have to do that. French nobles could collect feudal dues from their subjects, and the feudal dues would be not only obligations to do things, but also, the feudal dues meant working a certain number of days on the manor. Feudal dues also meant that if you were a peasant and you had livestock, the lord could take your best livestock, and had exclusive hunting and fishing privileges. And that's important, the hunting and fishing privileges, because hunting and fishing, particularly during the winter months, was a way that for centuries members of the peasant class had put protein on their tables. Anyway, east of the Elbe River. Now you're saying, what's the Elbe River? Basically, that hurts my hands. The Elbe River, which you can look on a map somewhere, the Elbe River basically separates Eastern Europe from Western Europe. The Elbe River runs north and south through Germany. It's from south to north through Germany, yeah. And basically is an unofficial dividing line between East and Western Europe. East of the Elbe River, in other words, in Eastern Europe, rights of the nobles became more pronounced and the condition of the peasantry more desperate. So, in Poland, thousands of nobles, the Szlachta, were exempted from paying taxes entirely after 1741. Until 1766, these Polish nobles possessed the rights of life and death over their subjects, their peasants. In Prussia, after the ascension to the throne of Frederick the Great, the Junker nobles, I told you that word would come back to haunt you, the Junkers, the landowning class that will dominate the officer corps. And they also held, They, Johnny. They also held most of the bureaucratic positions in the army. In Russia, the 18th century saw the rebirth of the nobility into more of a Western mold. Thank you, Peter the Great. Peter the Great, in his table of ranks, which is one of the ways that Peter the Great changed Russia, Peter the Great set up this table of ranks, which associated a person's rank with his service to the royal family. Where is that? Yes. This was reduced to 25 years service under Tsarina Anne. Peter III exempted nobles from this service entirely. Peter III was a bumbling fool. Remember, he's the one that got beat to death. Catherine the Great, I should put in there, yes. Sorry, Mr. Arlinghouse. Associated the rights of the nobility with service. She instituted the Charter of the Nobility, included the right to confer nobility status upon a wife and children, the judicial protection of nobles' rights and property, power over the serf, and exemption from taxes. The 18th century saw what was called the aristocratic resurgence, meaning that the nobility wanted to hedge power. I knew I had this wrong. Against the power of the king. Yes. So yes, the 18th century saw the aristocratic resurgence, the nobility wanting to hedge power against the rise of the king. It made it more difficult to become a noble. That was the noble's idea, because who wants to have lots of nobles? Then it's not special to be a noble anymore. They pushed to reserve slots in the officer corps, the bureaucracies of government, the government ministries, and the church exclusively to the nobility. Used the parliaments against the king, and sought to gain further exemptions from taxes and more collection of feudal dues from the peasantry. Okay, land and its cultivation was the basis for the economy of the 18th century. Well over 3/4 of the population lived in rural areas, yes. Few people ever traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace in the 18th century. Rural social dependency was tied directly to the land. In other words, everybody was farmers. Peasants, such as the English tenants and the French cultivators, were free men, except that they didn't have any money, really. Serfs, as found in Eastern Europe, were once again slaves, were tied to the land. Tied as were their children to the land, and were almost slaves. The word almost there means they could choose who they married, but not much else, and they had to marry somebody from within the manor. As it says there, serfs were tied, as were their children, to the land, and were almost slaves. Ownership of land meant everything. Not owning land meant an absence of power and control over one's life. I should put lack of control. Very good. On the continent, the burden of taxation fell on the tillers of the soil, the farmers, of whom most people were. They were poor farmers. The power of the nobility and the plight of the underclass increased. That's an important thing to remember. The power of the nobility, in other words, the nobility got stronger and stronger, and the plight of the serfs and peasants became worse and worse the farther you went. And how did you do that? You were so dumb. From west to east across Europe. Nearly all French peasants were subject to feudal dues called penalties. These included the required for use payment to the seigneur, that's lord's mill to grind grain for bread. You say, what does that mean? Well, so you're a peasant or a serf, and you live on the lord's manor, on his land. You grow your primary source of carbohydrates up until the 19th century is grain. You grow certain kinds of grain, wheat, barley, oats, etc., etc. Well, that grain has to be ground into flour powder so it can be used to bake bread, the staple of life. Well, you couldn't do that yourself. You couldn't just, get two big rocks and sit there and, grind the grain and then make your own and keep all of your grain to yourself. You couldn't do that. No, you were required to, I just got a text from Spain. You were required to use the Lord's mill. Why? Because when you did it, you had to pay the Lord. Not only did you pay him to live on your land, you paid him to grind your grain into bread. He got to keep that as well. I mean, it was really a closed economy. This in New York had also assigned a certain number of days per year of the peasants' labor, called the corvée, a tax collected in labor. Even though many monarchs tried to ease the plight of the peasants, like Joseph II, it was to little avail, especially in Eastern Europe. In the Habsburg lands of Austria, law and custom required the serfs to provide service, or, you like this, Mr. Arlinghouse? Or robot. Who says I'm not funny? Yeah, in the Austrian Empire, service as a tax, in other words, doing work as a payment for a tax, is called a robot. In France and in Western Europe, it was called the corvée. Two words that are on your test. Russia was the home of the worst serf treatment. Russian landlords looked upon serfs as economic commodities. The Russian landlords, could demand as much as 6 days per week of labor, known as the barshina, from the serfs. Serfs had no legal recourse against orders and whims of their lords. Russian serfdom was very equal to slavery. In the Ottoman Empire, peasants were free, but the nobility constantly tried to keep them under servitude. The domain of an Ottoman Empire's landlord was called a sift. The landlord was often absentee in the Ottoman Empire, who managed the estate through an overseer. There it is. Balkan peasants often became largely independent of landlords, even though never to the extent of Eastern Europe or Russian serfs. That should be dependent, largely dependent. Balkan peasants became largely dependent. In other words, they had to do what they said, but never to the extent of Eastern Europe or Russian serfs. Peasants, of course, I'm looking for a place to stop. We'll stop there. Peasants, of course, sometimes revolted against harsh rule. Peter the Great gave entire villages of peasants to certain nobles. Catherine the Great later confirmed this practice in exchange for the landowners' political cooperation, aka the Pugachev Rebellion. In Russia, well over 50 peasant revolts occurred between 1762 and 1769 in Russia. This one is on your test, the Pugachev Rebellion. Interesting rebellion. The Pugachev Rebellion took place after the murder of Peter III, the husband of Catherine the Great. And so this guy, he was a peasant he was a Russian peasant who went around claiming that the spirit of Peter III was in his body, was in him, and that his job was to go to Moscow and take over because he was the rightful czar. The most miraculous thing is that, he promised all these improvements to all the peasants and serfs in Russia, and the most miraculous thing was he got a pretty big following. It was eventually crushed, but not before Catherine the Great had to cut some real deals with her nobility, which actually curtailed a lot of her Enlightenment ideology. So yeah, the Pugachev Rebellion, it's also on your test. There were almost no revolts in Western Europe, but England had several rural riots. These were normally directed at property, not at persons. The peasants also targeted the old traditional methods of subjugation. This included unfair pricing, in other words, not paying the peasants a decent wage for their crop, new feudal dues and taxes, changes in the methods of payment, unjust officials, and unfair or brutal overseers or lord, etc., etc., etc. Peasant revolts were thus conservative in nature, and we will stop there today. So, yes, ready and